Today we're going to be multiplying decimals. Before we begin, let's address a common misunderstanding in multiplication. Most people think that whenever you multiply a number by another number, the product will be larger than the original number. This is not always the case. Let's take a look at these two multiplication problems. In this first problem, we have 5 times 3. And if you look at 5 times 3, we're going to take our starting number as 5, and we're multiplying 5 by the number 3, which is greater than 1. And we're going to get our product of 15, which is greater than our original number of 5. However, if we look below, we are now taking the number 5, and we are multiplying it by 25 hundredths, which also is equivalent to 1/4, which is less than 1. And when we multiply 5 by 25 hundredths, we're going to get a product of 1 and 25 hundredths. And we can see that 1 and 25 hundredths is indeed smaller than our original number of 5. So in this case, our product is not greater than the original number. So in order to clarify this and make this statement true, we have to change it. So instead of saying that whenever you multiply a number by another number, we have to clarify and say that whenever you multiply a number by another number greater than 1, the product will be larger than the original number. If you have a video journal sheet to follow along with this video, please make sure you have it glued into your math journal. You also want to make sure you have a pencil and a highlighter available to complete the sheet. Now let's begin. Multiplying decimals is a lot like multiplying whole numbers, but because there is a big difference when we add the decimal factor in, it is really important in these cases to make sure that we estimate before we solve to make sure that our answer is somewhat reasonable. So in this case, first step 1, we're going to follow an algorithm just like we did in multiplying whole numbers. The first thing we want to do is estimate to find a general range for our answer by rounding the two numbers to the greatest place and multiplying. So for example, here we have 7 and 8/10. We are going to round that to the greatest place, and that's going to take us to the number 8. Then we're multiplying it by 5 and 1/10, and we want to round 5 and 1/10 to the greatest place, and that's going to give us an answer of 5. And if I take those two rounded numbers and I multiply them by each other, I'm going to get an estimate of 40. Now, my answer needs to be in the ballpark of 40. That doesn't mean it has to be 39 and 5/10, but it means it has to be a lot closer to 40 than, say, 3,900. So for step 2, we're going to forget about the decimals, and we're going to line the numbers up and multiply like we would two whole numbers. Here you can see I have removed the decimals, but I only did that to be able to show you that I was lining them up as if I had no decimal. I'm going to put the decimals back in because I definitely don't want to forget them once I get to the end of this problem. Now that I've lined the problem up, I'm going to multiply as if I had no decimals in place, just like I would multiply two whole numbers. So I'm going to begin with my 1. I'm going to multiply it by my 1's place here, and I'm going to get an answer of 8. So 1 times 8 is 8. And then I'm going to move on. I'm going to multiply the 1 by the 7 over here, and I'm going to get an answer of 7. Now I'm going to move on to multiplying by the 5, but I know this isn't the tens place. Like normally we would say we're going to add a placeholder 0 because we're multiplying by tens, but in decimals, we know every place to the left is 10 times greater. So I'm still going to have to add that placeholder 0 here before I can go ahead and multiply by 5 because it is still 10 times greater than the 1. So if I take 5 and I multiply it by 8, that's going to give me 40. So I'm going to carry my 4. And then I'm going to multiply 5 times 7, which gives me 35. And then I'm going to add the 4 in. It's going to give me 39. And now I can add my two partial products. So if I add 78 plus 3,900, I'm going to get 3,978. However, this is not my answer because I still have my decimals to place in the problem. Let's take a look at how we would do that. So, where does my decimal go? Well, according to step 3, it tells me to count the number of spaces to the right of the decimal point in both factors. Well, if I know my definition of vocabulary, I know that my factors are listed right here, and it's asking me to count the number of spaces to the right of the decimal point in both factors. So if I'm looking over here, I have a decimal point. I have one space to the right of that decimal point, giving me a 1. And if I look down here in this factor, I have one space to the right of that decimal point, giving me a number of 1. And the instructions tell me to add those two numbers together. So if I add 1 plus 1, I'm going to get 2. Now, I'm going to go back into my answer at the bottom, and I'm going to look at step 4, and it says, in your answer, begin from the right and count the same number of spaces over as your total from step 3. That's where you will place your decimal. So if I look here, I have 2 places over here, but I'm going to start just to the right of my number, and I'm going to count over 1, 2 spaces, and that is where I'm going to place my decimal. So in this case, my answer would be 39 7/78. Now step number 5 is telling me to go back and check my answer with the estimate. If you remember correctly, my estimate was 40. And that's where I told you that it's really important to estimate, because I will know that whether or not I placed my decimal in the correct spot. Because if I did not place my decimal in the correct spot, my answer would be closer to 3,000 or 4,000. It would be about 3,978 or 397 8/10. But I can tell by where I have placed my decimal that 39 7/8 is really close to 40. Now let's practice some together. So if I look at this problem, I am multiplying 99 hundredths by 4 3/10. So the first thing that I need to do is estimate. If I look at 99 hundredths and I round this to the greatest place, which is the tenths, or I could even round it to the ones, I'm going to get the answer of 1. And if I look at 4 3/10 and I round to the greatest place, I'm going to get 4. So my estimate is going to be 1 times 4, which is going to be a grand total of 4. Now I'm going to continue with the next step. I'm going to line up my problems and pretend that, or my factors, and pretend that they don't have a decimal point. So I'm going to line them up flush right, and I'm going to put my decimal points in. Now, this is one difference. If I am adding or subtracting decimals, I know that it's important to line them up by the decimal point. But when I multiply or divide decimals, I do not line them up by the decimal point. Now that I have my problem lined up, I'm going to multiply through. I'm going to begin with multiplying by my 3. Now I'm going to put my placeholder in so I can begin to multiply by my 4. And when I add my partial products together, I'm going to get 4, 2, 5, and 7. But now it's important that I add my decimal back into the problem. So according to my instructions, if I look at my first factor here, I have 1, 2 spaces to the right of the decimal. And if I look at my second factor here, I have 1 space to the right of my decimal. And if I add those two together, that's going to give me a grand total of 3. Now as I come down and I look to place my decimal in my answer, I'm going to use that 3, and I'm going to count 3 spaces in from the right. And that is going to give me an answer of 4 257 thousandths. Now the final step is to compare that to my estimate. And if you look, 4 257 thousandths is pretty close to the number 4, which was my estimate. For this problem, our estimate is going to be 3 times 2 when rounding to the greatest place, and that's going to give me an estimate of 6. Again, I will line the problem up flush to the right, and I'll multiply as if there is no decimal. And finally, I'm going to count how many spaces to the right of my decimal. I have 2 up here. I have 1 here, giving me a total of 3. And so in my answer, I'm going to count over 3 spaces and put my decimal. And as I can see, 4 and 352 thousandths is pretty close to 6. Did you get an estimate of 60? If you did, go ahead and continue. Pause the video as you solve the rest of the problem. Did you get the same answer of 73 and 216 thousandths? All right, let's continue. For this last problem, I would like for you to pause the video to solve the problem on your own. So first of all, I'm going to ask you to pause the video and then come up with your estimate and check back just to make sure that your estimate matches my estimate. You should have gotten an estimate close to 400. Now pause the video and solve the problem and see if you can get the answer. Well, did you get the same answer I did? 398 and 1600ths? If you did, that's pretty good. It comes very close to our estimate of 400. Thank you for joining me today and learning how to multiply decimals.